I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Heimer.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we've got 4 rich, substantive, and compelling topics to tackle, so let's get right to it. The first is free market fundamentalism versus national conservatism. Number 2 is the prospective nuking of the filibuster. Our third topic will tackle racial division in education, K through 12 and beyond. And lastly, we'll talk about the politicization of the military and the implications for our national security. So with that, let me turn it over to Josh to talk about free market fundamentalism versus national economic conservatism.
So thanks, Ben. So we normally kind of finish these podcasts on a slightly more theoretical level. So it's a little unusual perhaps to open up, but this is a very pressing conversation. It's really kind of been brought to the forefront. It's something that I think we've teased and really kind of started to dive into a little bit over some previous podcasts. So the reason why we're talking about this, Ben, you know all too well, is that you and I were actually 2 of the 4 people who responded to this lengthy public discourse essay recently from Sam Gregg of the Acton Institute. Sam is a religious Catholic who is a staunch defender of kind of lowercase o orthodox classical liberalism, free market economics, et cetera. And what's going on in the backdrop here, what you and I were asked to respond to, along with Dan McCarthy of Modern Age and Patrick Brown of formerly of The Hill, I guess now at American Compass, is we were just kind of asked to respond and give a slightly more, what I would say, kind of a rounded, kind of fulsome perspective on the intersection between traditional conservatism and the free market. And obviously, this is what's going on in the backdrop here, of course, is the election of Donald Trump in 2016, kind of this resurgence of a more kind of nationalist, I don't particularly like this word, but a slightly more populist kind of tinge of conservatism. And I think what a lot of conservatives are doing, and certainly we've talked about this in the podcast all the time here, is we're kind of reassessing first principles. And what we're really trying to get back to is Irving Kristol wrote a famous book in 1978 called 2 Cheers for Capitalism. Irving Kristol, unlike his son, at least from my perspective, was a brilliant intellectual. And Irving basically said that capitalism is a deeply efficient tool. It is an indispensable tool for achieving prosperity, for lifting all boats, for GDP, for market efficiency, for all of these things that no one particularly questions. But it is subservient to various institutions, namely the nation state and the family. And to that end, the government has a legitimate role in putting its thumb on the scale to channel market forces towards the traditional conservative goals of justice, human flourishing, and the common good. And this is kind of the impetus ultimately for the formation of Orrin Cass's group, American Compass, which happened last year. Our Edmund Burke Foundation friend and colleague, David Brogg, wrote an essay at American Affairs Journal last November titled Reclaiming Conservative Economics, kind of tracing a lineage going back all the way to really kind of prior to Edmund Burke, actually, but starting at the latest at Burke, talking about basic notions of when the market and the national interest conflict. What do you choose? And, Ben, I know that you'll talk about this, but in your response to this Sam Gregg essay, you talked about basically when the nation state and the market conflict, and here we're talking specifically about China and trade, the nation state simply has to win out. And it seems to me that there's a lot of intellectual energy on the kind of the young right, the new right, if you will, for kind of reclaiming this kind of lost notion of 2 cheers for capitalism. And look, no one here is bashing the free market. Again, the free market is a beautiful, wonderful tool, but it cannot plausibly be the be-all, end-all of our politics. Similarly, you have this notion, which is closely related to this, of kind of private sector fundamentalism, right? Which is kind of a closely analogous concept to market fundamentalism. We see this in the big tech arena all the time. We see, the libertarian smart set just say, build your own Google, just say that Amazon can ban Ryan Anderson's book. Amazon shouldn't give in to workers trying to rally in Alabama to unionize. And I think conservatives are basically making a mistake here. They're making a mistake here by letting abstract rationalist theory take precedence over concrete, pragmatic cohesion, solidarity, and consolidation. So there's really kind of a lot to unpack here. Woke capitalism itself is something that we talked a lot about in previous episodes. Kind of the wokeization, if you will, of the Fortune 500 is something that conservatives simply cannot ignore any longer. It is very much in front of us right now. So the broader context here is, are we 2 cheers for capitalism people? Are we 2.5? Are we 3 cheers for capitalism people here? No one here obviously is a 1 cheer for capitalism socialist or anything like that, with the sweet spot between 2 and 3. So, let's have a discussion about this. Let's open it up. Ben, do you want to start because you joined me in responding to this Sam Gregg essay?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. And I feel like I maybe had the easiest aspect of the essay to critique in that China sort of perfectly crystallizes kind of the broader issues that are implicated when we talk about economics. And the way that I sort of framed my argument was, and just to be clear, Greg was sort of saying that our relations with China do not demonstrate that we ought to sort of turn away from what is at least characterized as free trade, although I would argue that what we've had with China is never free, fair, or reciprocal in trade, which is part of what the Trump administration was trying to get at with the so-called trade war in any event. But the real question is, what are the stakes and what is in the national interest? And to the extent our economic self-interest aligns with the national interest, that's great. Obviously, and of course, we have nothing close to a free market economy in the eyes of, say, the Austrian economists, for example. But let's say our relatively free enterprise system allows people to pursue whatever they believe they were put on earth to pursue, to keep the fruits of their labor, ultimately to have flourishing lives, communities, and ultimately that all leads to the good. And then there's obviously the practical aspect of, look, a portion of the fruits of that labor also go towards defending the country and underwriting all the institutions that exist to protect and preserve our rights in the ideal world. China presents a scenario, of course, where we've been trading with the Chinese Communist Party controlled country for almost 5 decades now. And as a consequence of that, we have helped aid, abet, and enable the growth of the most formidable adversary America has faced since the Soviet Union, and arguably a much more formidable adversary in no small part because we are so inextricably intertwined with China as a consequence of that trade. And so what I suggest is that the way to look at the free trade aspect of free enterprise economics is, look, free trade to the extent it really exists is great in terms of no one having tariffs, no non-tariff barriers to trade, et cetera. There's comparative advantage and everyone produces what they're best at producing. And we trade what we are best in for what others are best in, and everyone benefits as a consequence of it. That's not what we ever had with China. And it's clearly not what we have with China today. But even more importantly, the trade with China has actually served to the detriment of America's national interest, I would argue. Sam Gregg talks about America being able to get cheap goods, essentially, for this trade and opening up our enterprises to a massive marketplace. But the downside has been the hollowing out of manufacturing and industry in America. And in particular, it's created a situation in which our supply chains run through China in the most vital areas. Obviously, you saw this during the coronavirus when it comes to medicine and pharmaceuticals, more broadly, personal protective equipment and the like. We have major gaps in our defense industrial base, meaning that essential hardware for a military has components from China. We're reliant on China in order to get aircraft up in the air and all the rest of the litany of weaponry that we need to be able to survive. And then, of course, there's obviously all of the knock-on effects of the offshoring of vital jobs in America, which have led to the erosion of communities and all sorts of generational consequences. So that creative destruction, which maybe is artificial because we've never really had free trade with China in the first place, has also led to a scenario in which the destruction we've never worked through the destruction. And free marketeers would say, well, look, labor markets would adjust more quickly and there'd be a quicker answer if we were more free. And that may well be the case, but we have to deal with the practical consequences of the fact that it's a strategic imperative for America to have control and independence of vital industries for the national interest. And we have not had that. And there have been all these knock-on consequences. So all I suggest in my essay, and I think it's the logical sort of response is, look, it's a strategic imperative for our country to be competitive with China. And that requires reshoring jobs in these essential industries, having independent manufacturing and industrial capacity in critical areas. If using tariffs or other sticks against China is the best way to bring it to the table in service of our national interest, then we obviously ought to combat it in any way we can. And ultimately, what does it matter if you've sold out your country for perceived economic self-interest and ultimately created an adversary, which will make America, at very best in the long run, if this trajectory continues, a vassal of communist China? So that was sort of my argument. And I think it has applications that go far beyond just foreign policy and free trade as well.
One of the things I think that caught my eye in Sam Gregg's initial essay was this idea of, he kept coming back to unintended consequences. He would, sort of head pat a lot of the, well, no, I mean, not merely head pat. He gave them, I think, genuine reflection. A lot of the points that conservatives have been bringing up, which is this like, market worship, whatever's best for the GDP is naturally what we align with. But I think where he didn't really come down on this, and I think where the crux of the debate really is unintended consequences of our focus on economic policy for whom? And that's what I think this entire debate is about, because I think, Josh, as you've said before on this issue generally, it's about, how do we align our policies? And I think conservatism has always seen the free market as incredibly important, but a means unto itself. It's always been, should be postured toward human flourishing, toward what makes us a strong society, strong families as the bedrock of that in particular. But what's interesting, I think, is that, there's this, we critique the economic devotion of sort of this libertarian policy emphasis, but I think also, more sort of nationalist style conservatives, or I would just say traditional conservatives, I think sometimes get wrapped around this axle of economics as well. And as I've been observing this debate over family policy and how the conservatives should respond to this, I see us kind of get hung up there as well, because it all boils down to this idea that, well, we want to help families, and the only way to do it, or the best way to do that, is to pay them. Right, is to actually push an economic driver toward them. When in reality, that may be, I don't know, part of the debate. And I actually think it's really good that we're having it. But I think more broadly speaking, there are massive forces at work in our society that are the ones dismantling the family. And our policies have definitely pushed in those directions. Our trade policy, for instance, I think has had a huge impact on this. Our immigration policies that prioritize cheap labor over the ability of people to actually seek jobs in their own country, huge impact on this. But really what's dismantling the family is, again, the deaths of despair, the opioid crisis hollowing out, middle America, the diminishment of communities and churches and all of these things. And our policy, I think, acts around the parameters of those problems. But I think when even traditional conservatives, I don't want us to get stuck in the trap of merely economic drivers as well. Economics is not the progenitor of all ills, just as it's not the panacea of it. And so that's where I think I would come down on a lot of this, is that, I want us to focus on economics, but our own policy solutions to address the broader social ills have to be as broad and as sweeping as the problem we are seeking to address.
Yeah, I'm so glad that I waited for Rachel to go first, because that's really an important segue to the point that I wanted to make, which is that we talk about the reason that I think conservatism is having this shifting perspective on capitalism. And literally, like, if you go back just 10 years, the way that people on the right were talking about capitalism was reverent and trying to make it sexy. And listen, like, it's tempting to see sometimes the works of capitalism as a miracle, but it's not. It's really about incentives, and it's about how that creates the system of efficiency. What's so interesting now is that we have capitalists like Jeff Bezos, who a Brookings study that was released in November found has amassed his net worth by just a disgusting amount of money over the course of the pandemic. And that has not made its way down to any of his workers, really. And there are a lot of corporations that have behaved that way over the course of the pandemic. And what that tells me is that we have a different class. We have a very different ruling class. We have a very different elite class than we used to. It's not to say that our ruling and elite class didn't always suffer from corruption. Of course it did, but it's very different now. There's no shared values, and they are they're using their money to different ends. And the same thing is what you'll observe when you go to some of these sadly hollowed out towns all over the country, like in Wisconsin, where I'm from, northern Wisconsin, where paper mills have closed, for instance, is you see again, there are empty churches. And so the three books that I always try to use to disentangle this are Primal Screams by Mary Eberstadt, Alienated America by Tim Carney, and Coming Apart by Charles Murray. And it gets to this question of the chicken or the egg. Did the sexual revolution cause us to be in this system, in this situation where capitalism is failing us dramatically, and we need to return to the well of Irving Kristol and say, how many cheers for capitalism should we really be giving? And so I think, yes, it's good that there's sort of like, I interviewed Sam Gregg and Oren Cass within like 2 days of each other last week, and it was really interesting. And there's more agreement than people realize. We do all share this sort of like consensus that at times that capitalism should be a means to an end, except for like hardcore libertarians. We do all share the consensus that capitalism produces good things. And so those are two really strong starting points. But when you get into the policy conversations about big tech or healthcare or whatever it is, they're much more difficult to hash out. But to Rachel's point, I think this has been a really productive conversation, and I'm glad it's one that's happening. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think you have to look at our culture, and there's certainly interplay, but I think you have to look at our culture as the driving factor behind why capitalism is failing us more than ever, it feels like right now.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed your interview of Oren, Emily. I'll check out your interview of Sam as well, but I think that's all extraordinarily well said. But Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what's going on Capitol Hill? I think we're recording this on Wednesday. There's some breaking news today about the filibuster, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, this is going to seem like a jarring transition, but it actually isn't, because I think a lot of what we're talking about now are systemic power structures and how they impact people. And the filibuster, believe it or not, I'm going to make it relate, because the filibuster in the Senate is, I think, a reflection of a power structure that right now Democrats are trying to upend. And what's been interesting about this is, in the campaign season, Senate Democrats were always like, we're going to blow up the filibuster. They made it very clear they intended to do that. And Joe Biden was always seen as the bulwark against this. Joe Biden, the institutionalist, Joe Biden, the big consumer of the product in the filibuster, or in the Senate, filibustered constantly. But now he's reflecting a not so subtle shift rhetorically that he may be opening to reforming the filibuster. So just to back up and talk about kind of what the filibuster actually is, I think in modern, we're sort of most all familiar with it, I think, in the construction of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's these endless speeches that prevent any, meaningful legislative action on the Senate floor. But the modern filibuster is really more of just simply not giving 60 votes to someone. And so simply saying, we're not going to get 60 votes to end the filibuster via invoking cloture means we cannot move forward. That is what's considered the modern filibuster. And so efforts to quote unquote nuke or break the filibuster, as has already been done on all nominees, including the Supreme Court, cabinet officials, most judicial nominees, that is all done now at 51 votes. The filibuster's ended with 51 votes. So the only filibuster left in the Senate is one on legislation. And that's what's under assault right now. And my case that I'm making today is that I think a lot of the frustration with the filibuster is actually misplaced. People talk about needing to break the filibuster because, we need the Senate to do something. The Senate doesn't do anything, and the filibuster is what's standing in the way of that. And I would say that's actually wrong. The filibuster, I think, is a very important tool, and it's what separates the House from the Senate. If you think about the House is set up intentionally to let the majority steamroll the minority. That's the point of the House. The Senate is the opposite. The Senate is centered around this idea of endless debate. All 100 senators have almost equal authority, and that is, again, by design, because it's a body of deliberation, and that means every senator has a chance to matter. And the filibuster makes them matter because it says, you can't steamroll me, you have to listen to me. If you want me to come to the table, you have to convince me to come to the table, and you have to take my concerns seriously. But the problem is the Senate isn't deliberating. The Senate does nothing. It's a very valid critique. The Senate doesn't do anything, but it's not because of the filibuster. It's because nothing happens on the Senate floor. The Senate does not meaningfully engage the legislative process anymore. I think it was last year I counted it. It was something like 6 amendment votes, all of 2019. That is just unheard of in the Senate's history. The Senate is supposed to be a place where bills come to the floor and there's 70, 80 amendment votes, most of them by the minority. This was the case in the Senates of the early 90s. You'd see endless amendments. And you know what was amazing about those Senates? You didn't have to have a filibuster on any of those bills. They passed at a simple majority because at the end of the day, filibuster is about being heard. Well, everyone was heard, right? And so the Senate we find ourselves in today, which I would argue started really under Harry Reid and has been continued and perpetuated by Mitch McConnell, is one where, individual senators are basically shut down. There are no amendments. There are no bills that are socialized at all in the Senate. They're written by the leadership staff with a couple of lobbyists and dropped on the membership with like 5 minutes to vote. Any senator that gets creative with the procedural mechanisms of the Senate is shunned, and then that practice is banned. They don't want this engagement, which is what makes the Senate what it is. And I think that has really destroyed what the Senate is, not the filibuster itself. The filibuster is merely a tool. It can be overcome. The senators just refuse to engage the process. And now we're in a situation where over the last 5 or 6 years, we've just seen, the deliberative nature of the Senate slowly be shaved away by these, the nuclear option on all these different procedural mechanisms. So again, should the filibuster on legislation be done away with? The Senate really has no point. We have a unicameral legislature at that point. We have a minor league House. And as someone who cares a lot about the Senate, I spent a good portion of my career there. I think it would be a shame. And I think it would do this country a detriment to not have that deliberative body as the upper chamber. So I'll open it up. I don't know. Emily, you observe a lot of the politics as I do. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is it broaches another really key issue for conservatives, which is that we have these conversations about norms. And I remember when I was at the Washington Examiner, we did an editorial board interview with Ted Cruz probably 3 years ago. And he said he was really thinking about changing his position on the filibuster because he had become increasingly convinced that, as wrong as it is, as soon as Democrats get power, they're going to do it. So if you're confident that Democrats are going to do it when they get power, what on earth is the point of just sort of dithering while you have the power to do it and use it to your own ends? It's bad, but it's going to be worse if you just sort of cede it to them because they seem entirely poised to do that. Now, that seems prescient. It seems like he is correct that Democrats, as soon as they seized power, they would use it to do something as radical as eliminate the filibuster. It sounds crazy to people in Washington. If you had told somebody in Washington 10 years ago that there would be very serious conversations about nuking the filibuster, it would have been sort of laughable, probably, to most people. And here we are in 2021, and it's actually a demand of very powerful House Democrats. It's not just sort of a suggestion or a priority, it's a demand. And that is a really telling statement. And so for conservatives, there is this conversation about, listen, Democrats are breaking all of these norms left and right. So what about us? I mean, don't we have to sort of like change our rules of engagement? They're doing it anyway. And I think that's a really essential sort of conversation of principles that this is bringing up and that this is raising. Something I was also thinking about while Rachel was talking, it's like, we act sometimes as though our norms in America are ancient, but like John Tyler still has a living grandson. Like, this country is not that old. And so it's not, this isn't a norm that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it is important. And it needs to be guarded. And you can't sort of take these types of things for granted. And I think from my perspective, what we did is take it for granted for so long because we had a functioning government, even when it felt frustrating. And we don't have a functioning government anymore. We really don't. I don't know if it's the 24-hour news cycle that did it. I don't know if it's heightened partisanship or partisan sorting. And you hear all these sort of like the senators love to wax nostalgic about what Washington used to be like and how they used to, I guess, have waitress sandwiches with Chris Dodd and Ted Kennedy. I don't know if it's better or worse, but that just doesn't really happen anymore. It clearly impacts their ability to work together on legislation. But this is a really good reminder that we're in a period of norm shattering, and we need to be prepared to make the right decisions because they will impact people for generations.
Yeah, what was the old nickname for the Senate? It was like the cooling saucer, right? The House was supposed to be like the hot tea kettle, and the Senate was supposed to be the cooling saucer to cool all the hot and intemperate passions and zealous deliberations that went over on the junior side of Capitol Hill. So look, the filibuster obviously is not required by the Constitution. It's not even statutory. It's just a Senate internal procedure sort of thing. But from a theoretical perspective, it does seem like it kind of directly trickles down. It's very much intellectually downstream of James Madison writing in Federalist 10 about factions, right, about kind of the fear of majoritarian tyranny. It does seem like it has attained not literally, but kind of a pseudo-constitutional status of sorts, insofar as the Constitution is viewed as having checks and balances and all these kind of counter-majoritarian checks. So would it be a good thing? No, it obviously would not be a good thing. The Senate, like Rachel said, I think would lose a lot of its distinctive flavor. But I think Emily is totally spot on here. You really can't divorce what's happening here from kind of the broader breakdown of some of our iconic institutions in America, one of which, of course, is the military, which we'll get to in a later segment on this podcast. But, you know, Yuval Levin writes a lot about institutional breakdown these days. He's also written a lot about how congressmen and senators too often view their perches on Capitol Hill as performative perches from which to kind of spew talking points to their respective echo chambers, be it on MSNBC or Fox News. Very, very, very little people here care actually about legislating, as Rachel says. That is, of course, totally true. Look, Ben Sasse, who's not necessarily someone who I think is, how shall we say this, in vogue, I guess, on many segments of the right these days. He nonetheless did have, I thought, a very kind of well-formulated line in his maiden Senate floor speech 7 years ago. It was a while ago at this point, where he basically said that Congress suffers from, quote, symbiotic legislative underreach. You often hear about overreach, but Sasse's point was actually that from Congress not doing its job, from kind of succumbing to this kind of a performative notion that Yuval Levin has talked so much about, what it's actually doing is that then necessarily empowering not just the administrative state, but of course the judicial branch and all the other actors to then overreach in direct response to Congress's underreach. So the entire structure of Congress is just fundamentally broken at this point. The incentives are simply not there for politicians to actually engage in deliberation. We are a very, very long way removed from Mr. Smith goes to Washington, but clearly ending the filibuster would not be a good idea, I think.
Yeah, I guess I'll wrap up by making a few points. First, I would say that to the extent the filibuster is nuked, which I don't think should shock anyone based upon where the animating elements are in the Democrat Party right now. This is sort of the natural conclusion of a sort of progressive slog that we've seen starting from the time in which we moved from state legislators selecting senators to where we are today in terms of popular vote. So I see this as just another step in this slog down progressivism as it impacts all of our institutions, and like we'll get to soon, even the military as well. There was also a clear telegraphing of this when President Obama described the filibuster in 2020 as, quote, a Jim Crow relic. So if the filibuster is racist, then you obviously have to junk it. It's very clear that all of the rationales, pretexts were already being created for where this inevitably, I believe, is going, regardless of what maybe a Senator Joe Manchin or a Kristen Sinema may say. I assume to the extent the commander-in-chief says one thing, the party will ultimately fall in line. Just two more points. Since Kennedy and Dodd were raised, I think, look, the Senate is now going to reflect exactly the type of people who left us this institution right now, that disgusting scene that Emily describes. I think, look, this is their legacy ultimately. And that legacy is one of power at any and all costs. The consequences be damned, the institutions be damned, the theory behind having an anti-majoritarian sort of Senate and why that's so essential for deliberation, and truly only legislation getting through where there is a broad consensus across the country and cooling the heat that flows out of the House. I think Democrats have shown quite clearly, and obviously, there's partisanship on both sides, and that obviously impacts the way issues are approached. But it's very clear that in this instance and in many other instances, Democrats are willing to win at all costs. Immediate term consequences be damned. Harry Reid himself warned of it when it came to the nuclear option before this, but clearly the party didn't care. And ultimately, we have to react accordingly as conservatives. I always go back to this point. What would Democrats do? What would Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer do in an equivalent situation? To the extent we have not formulated responses to a movement, and it transcends Democrats, it's really sort of a bipartisan ruling class vision. To the extent we have not developed responses commensurate with the assault that's going on right now, we are going to lose. It's just a fact of life. So we have to, again, consistent with conservative values and principles, tradition, history, Judeo-Christian ethics, and beyond, have to figure out a way to counter this onslaught, because in the absence of such a response, the other side is going to steamroll us.
Well, we've talked about in each of these segments so far, the sort of new regime creeping into our institutions, into corporate America, into the Senate. And now I want to talk about how it's creeping into education. It's not creeping into education. It's bulldozing our system of education. It was creeping for decades, but it is now bulldozed basically the entire K-12 system and higher education in this country. We are getting new reports literally by the day of how critical race theory is being implemented in various school districts around the country. We have a report up in the Federalist. We had a report last week. It's turned into a series of reports as the situation has evolved. So on February 26th, Naperville 203 Community Unit School District hosted a systemic racism training for faculty and staff. They brought in a, quote, anti-racist coach, Dina Simmons, for keynote speech. They had 10 speakers who lectured on, quote, equality and inclusion, practices for, quote, marginalized and or underrepresented students, as well as implicit bias and microaggressions. A whistleblower came to the Federalist and said that the anti-racist trainer said that, quote, our education is based on a foundation of whiteness and that Americans are, quote, spiritually murdering students. She also said that if you're not, quote, an anti-racist, you are racist, even if you believe you are treating people with respect. The school has quadrupled down, literally as of this week, as of this recording, on the training. They are defending it bitterly. We are learning about what's happening in California, the California school system. There's a vote on Thursday that could adopt a very radical curriculum, kind of in line with the themes we just discussed. And in higher education, Columbia University is literally having segregated graduation ceremonies, planned graduation ceremonies for students according to their race and other aspects of how they identify. This is important to think about in the context of this is starting literally in kindergarten and it goes through higher education. So what a lot of people would have seen as the campus craziness that was isolated to those liberal college campuses, no. This is now in kindergarten classrooms. And I think the key point of this, to read from the Federalist report, is that Simmons, the anti-racist coach, said, if you are not anti-racist, you are racist. That is the theme of Ibram X. Kendi's massively best-selling book that got super popular over the course of the summer. So the reason I bring that up is because if it's being taught in your kindergarten classroom, if it's being taught in your college classroom, to speak up is to be a racist. And racism is deeply stigmatized and rightly stigmatized in this country. And nobody wants to be a racist. And they shouldn't want to be a racist. And that creates an incredible disincentive for anybody to speak up and rebut the false, wrong, and dangerous talking points that are spewed by, quote, anti-racist coaches like Dina Simmons from kindergarten classrooms all the way through our university system. And again, we're learning more about these trainings that are taking place literally by the day. So with that, I'll kick it to my co-hosts and see who wants to jump in on this.
One thing I think that you said that was really kind of important about this whole debate is that, you know, this has been happening in the university systems, I think, for a while. And we all sort of wrote it off as like crazy college kids. And, you know, but it was a bigger threat because those crazy college kids are now our elite, right? They are running our major institutions. They are, you know, in higher positions of government, and they've actually let it escape the university system and sort of these elite strongholds. And it's now in public schools. And so I think when you raise people up this way, I mean, to your point, it's so insidious because I think, and we discussed this a little bit last time, I think this country has actually done a tremendous job in, you know, equality under the law and making this the freest society in America because our laws demand equality under the law for everyone. Now, does that always get implemented? No, and we've always tried to route that out where it doesn't happen. But we've made tremendous strides in this area such that, you know, Ibram X. Kendi has to make racism unconscious, right? Because there's actually not that many instances of overt racism. I would argue there is no really institutional systemic racism in America, but Ibram Kendi, you know, to peddle his falsehoods has to say it's unconscious, and that's how he, you know, sells this issue. And I just think it's this is one of the most dangerous threats I've seen, to what it means to be, a united America, and one that I think if we don't get a grip on, will seriously undermine not only our self-government, but our complete social consensus of what it means to live together.
Yeah, so just 2 points that I want to make. One is the notion that this is trickling down from the universities to high schools, even into elementary school, is now not even debated. I mean, Chris Rufo, with his investigative reporting at City Journal, has gone school district to school district, all the way from Buffalo to New York, down to San Diego, California, talking about the ways that this ideology is manifesting itself. I'm talking about critical race theory, of course, into public school curricula. Barry Weiss had a lengthy kind of deep dive also at City Journal last week, looking at kind of elite private schools in New York and Los Angeles. I was talking to my mom earlier this week. My mom's a public school third grade teacher in New York State. She told me that she's being mandated by her school district to do a unit on, quote, social justice poetry. I told her, I said, Mom, I would like to review this curriculum and make editorial suggestions if possible. I don't even know if she has the flexibility or the wiggle room to do that. But this is truly ubiquitous now and is deeply harrowing stuff. Look, if you lose the generation, you lose the country. I mean, this is necessarily true, right? I did a radio show with my buddy Jesse Kelly down in Houston a few weeks ago. We were talking about all this, and he basically said to me, Josh, like, what should we do? Like, should we counter with, like, quote unquote right wing indoctrination? And what I said was, Jesse, what we think of as quote unquote right wing indoctrination would have been viewed as the founders, and for at least 150 years after the founding, as a basic civics education. That is the functional equivalent of critical race theory indoctrination. It's just is literally just training you in the civics, right? But just one other point I want to make here, and something that we've already touched on: anti-racism, which is obviously kind of a nonsensical term unto itself, has kind of become the modern equivalent, if you will, of kind of the Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson racial shakedown. Back in like the 80s, the 90s, Jackson and Sharpton would go to businesses, try to kind of like harass them, say, unless you get on board with XYZ proposals, we'll kind of do a boycott. There is now a whole kind of anti-racism industry of sorts, right? And just this week in Newsweek, we had a debate on reparations, and my dear friend, the great David Azarad, filed an absolute barn burner of a piece, as he is wont to do, against reparations. And just like, I want to quote one very brief line from David's essay. He says here, quote, "Instead of charging $6,000 an hour lecturing corporate America on its white privilege, if we have reparations, that is, Robin DiAngelo would instead be selling plastic jewelry on the Home Shopping Network." So, I mean, that's kind of the point here, is that the incentives are clearly aligned to kind of make this a big thing. There are institutional actors, there are books to be sold, and all that stuff as well. But this is totally corrupt. It's garbage. And if we don't fight back, we literally will lose the country. That is not an exaggeration.
Yeah, and I would say, just to make it even a little bit more dire, I mean, we've been dealing with generations now of leftists dominating the commanding heights of all of our institutions, and it's a direct reflection of the fact that the long march through the education system was the starting point of all of this. So, there's one aspect of it, which is leftist indoctrination in schools, but the even more insidious part of this, just to tie a couple of threads together, is, look, the Ibram X. Kendi view of the world, that discrimination is justified if it essentially pays back people for, or is revenge for prior discrimination, and somehow that discrimination now against the former discriminators is going to make things better, is basically, it's a direct repudiation of the Martin Luther King vision of colorblindness, content of character over color of skin. It's instead making color of skin the primary item by which we judge and adjudicate every issue and how we craft all of our policies as a country. So that repudiation of Martin Luther King is a recipe for disunity, discord, tearing at the fabric of the country. And ultimately, I think it's pretty explicit that identity politics is about putting Americans at each other's throats. And obviously the point of that is divide and conquer and exploit, ultimately, when you rub raw these sores in our society. And that's what this is all ultimately about. Whether it's explicit or not, it's clearly the case that that's what the outcome is. Look, we would have never seen this anti-cultural revolution that we've seen in our streets and in our classrooms and boardrooms over the last year, were it not for the fact that these were the ideas that prevailed on campuses and they were never sufficiently or effectively combated. We have never really had an answer ultimately for the fact that the number 2 socializing institution beyond the family, our schools, has been controlled by people who hate our guts and reject all of the basic tenets, values, and principles that the country was really based on. And so we have to ask ourselves a question, and I don't know that anyone has formulated sort of the master plan for this yet, but what are all the different levers we can pull to ultimately change things? I mean, I would mandate, for example, that there be conservative studies in all public institutions. That's one thing. You can go after the people who fund the schools. You can do full audits of them. You can try to create a whole new generation of conservative PhDs to the extent they can ever make it through that process. We can think about all the different levers that we pull, and we have to think about these levers because you lose the schools. You do lose not only one generation, but ultimately you lose multiple generations. And we are all living on the campus now. The cliche is absolutely right. We should never dismiss the crazy ideas in campus because those crazy ideas become the mainstream ideas throughout all the commanding heights the day after. And I guess this is probably a good segue actually into the last segment, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the politicization of the military. And I think probably if you haven't followed this whole Tucker Carlson Department of Defense contretemps, then kind of where have you been, I guess would be my first comment about this. Tucker essentially criticized the Department of Defense and particularly the commander-in-chief for essentially being politically correct in his remarks about the military, where he simply asked the question essentially, why is the president focused on maternity flight suit development in our military rather than building the biggest, baddest fighting force that does the one job that it's supposed to do, which is win wars? And it's a place that has to be protected from impervious to politicization because first of all, if you don't have merit and you're not a merit-based force and you're not the strongest force you can possibly be, you're going to lose in war, which is really the only purpose of the Department of Defense, which used to be aptly called the War Department. And maybe that it's not called the War Department anymore is a sign of sort of the slog that we've had in this institution. But even beyond that, if you allow politicization and you create dissension within the forces, you harm morale. And ultimately, of course, to the extent you have politicized generals sort of freelancing, undermining administration or sniping at a commander-in-chief when they're out of office, obviously it sends a terrible signal down the ranks. And if you have that dissension and discord within the ranks and you don't have order, you're not going to have an effective force. There are other issues with political correctness in the ranks as well. Namely, for example, when you don't accurately identify who your adversaries are and what animates them on the one hand. And then also that, again, you don't promote people on the basis of rank and orient all of your activities towards building a dominant fighting force. The Tucker instance of the military accusing him essentially of being anti-women and a racist in their own news release, where they talk about smiting Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host. First, the fact that the military responds to any commentator itself speaks to a rot of politicization at the highest levels, and it should be deeply concerning. If it had happened under the Trump administration, you can imagine that the impeachment case would already be in full swing. But let's note that this is just one example in a long line of examples that we've seen over the last decade of politicization of the military. Remember that one of the first moves that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, instituted was a mandated stand-down order one day within the first 60 days after he achieved that position for extremism within the ranks. We've seen extremism ill-defined, but potentially meaning conservatives, obviously. We've also seen, for example, that the reading lists for the Navy, and this is really remarkable, for sailors to create the best thinkers in their own words, I think to cultivate the most intelligent and intellectually serious fighting force, lists Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, as well as Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, as sort of their foundational texts, among other texts. So now, if you are supposed to be defending this country, you don't read A.T. Mahan or Sun Tzu or Clausewitz, you read Ibram X. Kendi and Michelle Alexander. What could possibly go wrong in this scenario? But even going back, look at the last 4 years where you had generals, when they were out of office, openly attacking the president, potentially in violation of military code. You had ex-military senior officials in the military saying that, actually promoting the fact that the president should be wheeled out of the office if he refuses to leave, essentially a military coup. Obviously, you had essentially officials undermining the president's policy with respect to Afghanistan and elsewhere, where the president sought to remove troops from certain areas in the Middle East, and the general has prevented it, obfuscated it, deceived on that. And then you can even go back to the Obama years, and it's worth noting that, first of all, Major General Nadal Hassan, who shot up a military base at Fort Hood in Texas, it was very clear that he was an Islamist. I mean, he made it clear literally on his business card, yet he was still allowed to serve as, I believe, a psychiatrist in the military. Absolutely asinine. Why was he there? Well, many were afraid to speak up in the ranks because they didn't want to be perceived as Islamophobes. Even going beyond that, there was a purging of all materials that identified Islamist ideology within the Department of Defense and beyond as well. The animating ideology of the war fighters that we were competing with and fighting in the Middle East, you were not allowed to study the materials that went to their threat doctrine, again, for politically correct reasons. So you have real problems here of lack of readiness, insubordination. And then this is not even getting into the fact that it appears there's a fitness review that's underway in the military right now, which may in fact lower the standards. And the pretext for it, or the argument for it, is that, or the questions around it are, not enough women are passing these standards. Consequently, the standards are bigoted, or maybe we should look at other standards to ensure that doesn't happen. The end consequence of all of this is our national security, I would argue, is undermined. With that, let me open it up first to Emily for your response to the Tucker contra-attempt on the media side, and then more broadly, what to make of all this.
Well, I just have two quick points to make. The first of which is that it is deeply creepy to see the military spend so much time openly using their military resources. These are literal press releases attacking a journalist. And the media seems not to care because it's Tucker Carlson, but you can bet that if this were the military under the Trump administration putting out press releases and going in this sort of like weird, bizarrely coordinated attack on a liberal journalist, you can bet that would be bad. And so you can bet the media would be deeply concerned about it. And this is one of those situations where it's just creepy. And it reminds me of the intelligence community's attacks also on conservative journalists and on conservatives in general. It gets to this point about politicization of institutions where that's really dangerous. And I think this is another example, but this is maybe the creepiest example. This is maybe the most concerning example, because there was this like total full-throated opposition to Tucker Carlson put out with military resources this week. And what Tucker said was like not even, the problem is like not even controversial. It was in the wake of a leak that China had beat us in our own war games 10 years out. And that's important context for all of this. It was just a really creepy, coordinated campaign to attack a journalist. I just think that's an important bottom line. And the second quick point that I'll make, something I've been writing a lot about recently and thinking a lot about, is how the drive of political correctness is hampering our efficiency. And Bill Maher actually talked about this on his show last Friday, in that our race against China, do you know who's not worried about outdated stereotypes of Chinese people in Dr. Seuss books? The Chinese. They have other things to worry about. And so, you know, his entire thing, I think, sort of glossed over the extent to which authoritarianism drives their efficiency, of course, and in ways that we would never, ever want to emulate. But there's an important point that our institutions are being distracted. Think of how many people right now in our military are putting resources into these politically correct ends. And that's originally what Tucker was talking about, that we are using military resources that could be better spent elsewhere. And I think about all of the hiring and firing decisions that are now impacted, all of the layers. I mean, you look at college campuses, a huge part of the cost of college, something that's driven up tuition to just perfectly or completely unaffordable levels, is the fact that there's so many layers of bureaucracy, so many Title IX officers. Our institutions are just completely hobbled by political correctness because it's death by 1,000 cuts. So many people have said the cost benefit analysis supports us, you know, getting this Title IX officer in here, but then it's grown to be completely out of control, and it has left us a much more inefficient country. And I think that is becoming clearer by the day.
Yeah, my friend Daniel Horowitz, the delightfully anti-politically correct writer and commentator, has always said for years now that our generals in the military are more political than politicians themselves. And, you know, there have been any number of examples, but it's becoming increasingly impossible to deny at this point. And by the way, I feel obliged to point out that this is not just kind of capital D Democratic military officials. David Petraeus, who, if I recall correctly, flirted with running for partisan office under the partisan banner of the Republican Party. David Petraeus, since his service and his personal foibles, whatever they may be, now is kind of cashed out at KKR, a very kind of Tony private equity firm. But it was either in November or December. It was actually before January 6th, if I recall, that David Petraeus basically went on a rant of sorts where he basically said that white supremacy is increasingly like the biggest threat that America faces. This is the guy, just for everyone, so everyone is aware here. David Petraeus was the visionary of the so-called surge in 2007 in Iraq. This is someone who has seen the Islamist, the jihadist enemy up close and personal. He knows this extremely well. And at the time, it was either Mike Anton or Angelo Codevilla. I think it was Angelo who just wrote like a brutal takedown of what Petraeus said there about white supremacy being the biggest threat that America faces. But the point is that our top military brass has been politicized for a long time here. And, I think about like what Ben said, and Ben, you and I were messaging about this earlier this week about this reading list that the US Navy has put out for recommended reading material for sailors about like male privilege and male egos and white fragility and all of this nonsense. And I guess Ben, the way you phrased it to me was, if you were trying to destroy a country, what else would you do? Like, what else would you do? When did this notion arise that the military was supposed to do anything whatsoever other than to kill the enemy in the most efficient way possible while minimizing our own loss of life and then getting the hell out of there? That's what the military has been, what it ought to have been for thousands and thousands of years, literally going back to the Bible, for goodness sake. So this notion that the military should be involved in, democracy promotion overseas, the neoliberal, neoconservative hubris, it should be involved in social justice, literally anything other than its core mission of hunting down and killing the enemy in as efficient and as way as possible while minimizing loss of life. Anything that undermines that should be shelved. I literally think it's that simple. It's really sad, between the military and education. We try to be optimistic when possible on the show. Sometimes it's very difficult to do so, looking at the state of our education system, the state of our military. I guess the only kind of silver lining, the solace that I can take, is that conservatives do seem to be standing up in full force, supporting Tucker on this. But it really is quite sad to see.
We talk a lot, I think we talked a lot this episode about the degradation of institutions, generally speaking, but the military, I think, especially on the right, was always held out as like, the last pinnacle, the last bastion of, patriotism and solidarity behind, this idea of what the United States stands for. And that's what I think hit people so hard about this overt action by military brass to take on Tucker Carlson, because guys, it was only 11 years ago that Stanley McChrystal was fired or pushed out of the Obama administration for, critiquing or seeming to critique the administration's policy in Afghanistan and the people implementing it in Rolling Stone magazine. And I think it was largely viewed as almost appropriate. I mean, I think he had a few defenders, but I think most people were like, yeah, the military shouldn't be political. Active duty shouldn't be making these statements. And he was critical of Obama and the ambassador to Afghanistan and all these things. It's only 11 years later, the pendulum has swung so far that activity is now encouraged. It wasn't just Tucker Carlson this week. It was Marjorie Taylor Greene got a visit. I don't know if you guys saw this, from the National Guard unit of Guam, because she had said something erroneous about Guam being a foreign land or something. And so the entire unit was marched to her office. And it was a very creepy sight, actually, to use Emily's term, to watch, active duty military march basically down the halls of Congress for the purpose of basically intimidation. Right? They wanted to tell her, no, you're wrong about Guam. And that's fine, right? Like if someone from the unit was like, hey, I'm actually from Guam and we're part of the United States. Okay, fine. But that wasn't the intent here. The intent was something more insidious, which was to bring a military unit to the member of Congress, for the purpose of calling them out. Now, no word on if they actually went to see Hank Johnson, the congressman who thought Guam was going to flip over from too many troops on it. But, whatever, I digress. But the point I think stands here that it's just a real diminishment of the American military and the accomplishments that the military has had. And to Josh's point, the purpose of it, which is to protect our national sovereignty in the most ingenious, efficient ways possible. And that is not their focus anymore. We're going down the drain if that's the case. I'm darker on it than Josh. I'm not even finding a silver lining here. on that point.
Well, I guess a perverse silver lining that we can take away from this is, I guess, that the top brass, at least, but even those down from the top brass who are tweeting and sending videos from their social media accounts attacking Tucker, I guess they're all following the lead of the commander in chief. So to some extent, there is order in the ranks, I guess. It's just a perverse order that undermines the exact thing the institution exists to protect. And I would say, this is really kind of the conclusion of the left's long march. It started in the schools, but it ends at the military. And obviously the consequences are devastating. I think it's worth quoting Tucker here from, I guess, an editorial adapted from one of his monologues. And he says this, and I just think it can't really be put any better. Quote, "The U.S. military exists to fight and win wars. That is its only purpose. The U.S. military is not an NGO. It is not a vehicle for achieving equity. It is not a social experiment. It's definitely not an employment agency. Nobody has a God-given right to work in the military." And he concludes, "Making people feel valued and included is a good thing, but it is not the point of the U.S. military. It cannot be the point of the U.S. military, or else we're done." So on that sunny note, I want to go around the room and ask for final thoughts, and maybe we'll start here with Rachel.
So I think to just take us back to kind of where we started, because I think a lot of what we're talking about is the outgrowth of our culture. And I think conservatives have ceded that territory in many ways, almost intentionally, because I think we've said, and this goes back to sort of the economic argument, we've ceded the pillars of economic progress, in institutions and mechanisms, because we've said, well, the free market will work. Well, the free market cannot solve all cultural problems because they're inherently not economic. And so I think by backing out of that and electing people who would rather say, or rather focus their policy choices and their, policy consequences on just the, outcome of economic interactions, we've left a lot on the table, and we're now seeing the consequences of that. And this is a broader conversation. You can say it's an indictment of fusionism, an indictment of the sort of libertarian ethos, and they're capturing the Republican Party. But we are now, the consequences are very clear, and how conservatives respond to this has to be our driving focus, I think, for the next 10 years, or we've signed the death warrant on our own relevance, because if we don't get this right, what it means to be an American, I think, fundamentally changes, and we don't even have a say in what it means anymore.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead, Josh.
You go for it.
Well, I was going to say, I think fusionism made sense when we had sort of some of these shared fundamental values. And that reminded me of what we were talking about earlier, about how this class of capitalists and of, barons, basically the moguls of today, they don't have the shared values of the rest of the country. And they're actually sort of the useful idiots, or the people, like if you think of Jack Dorsey or Jeff Bezos, that are crippling our efficiency by importing all of this woke ideology into their corporations for the sake of what they think in the short term is higher profits. And so it makes absolutely no sense anymore to sort of like continue that calculation. And when you think about it in the context of China, which is my final thought at the end of day, it's frightening. So Nomadland is a beautiful movie. It's on Hulu. It was made by Chloe Zhao, an Asian American director. She was born in China to wealthy parents, and she does an absolutely gorgeous job. This was just nominated for a bunch of Oscars, as it should be. She does a gorgeous job detailing or chronicling the story of a white working class woman from a town in Nevada, a real town in Nevada, where the gypsum plant closed. And basically the company town became a ghost town. And it's gorgeous, but China doesn't know what to do with the movie. There's a professor who said, actually, Chloe Zhao may have expressed some anti-China sentiments, but this movie makes us look good. Because it makes America look bad. And that gets to what Bill Maher was saying about how our sort of obsession with political correctness is completely distracting us from the battle to sort of restore our efficiency and to win the geopolitical race against China, and to ensure that more and more people have freedoms, the freedoms that American citizenship provides, and that we can continue to be a great nation. And we just are so hobbled, and we are so distracted from that. And it's, again, to sort of echo everybody in the last couple of minutes as we've been talking, it's just a really, really dark place.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of piggyback off of what we were saying earlier about Yuval Levin's recent work on institutional breakdown. It increasingly seems to me that conservatives cannot content themselves with the talking points of simply building parallel institutions. This is kind of taking the Rodri or Benedict doctrine to its extreme, right? And kind of trying to silo ourselves off. Because something else is also true at the same time. And it's something that Eric Erickson said in a Red State post that went viral many years ago, which is, you will be made to care. They will come to you. They will make you care. We see this over and over again. It has literally never become more obvious, I think, over the past few years. And what's more than that is the whole kind of parallel institution infrastructure, talking point at least, kind of exists in the hypothetical world where things like Parler being collusively nuked, by Google, Amazon, Apple cannot happen. So I would encourage kind of conservative leaning entrepreneurs to continue to try to build out things like new tech infrastructure and things of that nature. But I increasingly think that that is not a panacea, and that we really do need to try to get in there, so to speak, get under the nails, get under the skin, and try to fight for control of some of the kind of current institutions that predominate society. On a personal note, I feel very privileged, I guess, blessed to be able to do precisely this at Newsweek, a formerly kind of liberal institution that has kind of new, kind of woke, skeptical leadership. And it's allowed me to kind of to do what I do, I guess, for lack of a better term, which has been wonderful. And it's obviously not that easy to replicate that, but that has to, I think, somehow, even though it's not easy, be the model, because we have to get in there and fight. And something is like education is a good example of this. If you are a citizen who was concerned about the wokeization of third and fourth graders, who's concerned about critical race theory ideology being shoved down your kindergartner's throat, get in there and run for school board. Get active. Don't just sit there and kind of grovel. Don't give anonymous quotes to Barry Weiss writing these 4,000 word essays. Get in there and be active, because we have to fight for these institutions, or else they will just go down this rabbit hole, this whirlpool, and we eventually just won't have a country at that point.
On that note, I want to turn back to the kind of economics conversation that we were having. And the economy really is a reflection at the end of the day of the culture. And if materialism, which is kind of the Marxist model of the world, is what predominates in the culture, it's going to be reflected in our economy. It's going to be reflected in all of our institutions. And we are idealists as a country, not materialists. And I think it's important to make that point. The striking thing is that, and we've sort of alluded to this during these kind of parting shots, is that the greatest beneficiaries of commerce are the ones doing the greatest job undermining it by backing the woke conquest of our country. That is the cultural and economic Marxists that literally lit the country on fire over last summer and continue to be the ones, or at least they're useful idiots, or true believers or dupes are the ones running the commanding heights of society right now. And of course, the greatest beneficiaries of commerce, those running most of our multinational corporations, also kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party, which only accentuates the problem. All of that said, for all the problems that we've touched on today, still half the country has its head on relatively straight, which is, I think, a reflection of the fact that the facts of life ultimately do prove to be conservative, but the longer portions of the country exist in suspended sort of adolescence, or are kind of infantilized by their political leaders, by the rest of the ruling class as well, it's obviously going to continue to degrade that half of the country and undermine it. But all of that said, one of the critical things we do here, and that I think it's imperative to do, is recognize the problem openly and honestly, without blinders, without naivete, without political correctness. We try to do that here. And we also try to understand and frame these issues in terms of what are the ultimate stakes. And that is the imperative first step before we get to the daunting question of how do we respond to all these problems. It goes back also to where conservatives debated with respect to Trump. How you felt about Trump, to some extent, was a function of what you felt about the stakes of what was at hand over the last 4 years and where you thought all of these institutions stood. But it's an even more transcendent issue that we're grappling with. And I think the good thing is we're seeing a little bit more of a consensus, I think, on the conservative side develop around the fact that, look, all of our institutions really have been taken over by people who hate our guts and want to purge us from American life. But yet the sun still rises the next day. We still have to live here, raise our families here, grow old in this country. There's no other place to go. So all that said, hopefully this show serves as something of a rallying cry that we owe it to our forefathers as well as our progeny to do everything we can to take back these institutions ultimately. And of course, it starts with recognizing the size, scope, and nature of the problems before you get to the daunting task of solving them. So on that note, on behalf of Josh, Emily, and Rachel, thanks for tuning in. Please do subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll all see you on the next NatCon Squad.